and then you can start with your lecture.
Yeah.
Hello, hi, namaskar, everyone. I welcome you all to the Voices from the Periphery. I am Udisha Doloy, and hereby we all sit together to enlighten ourselves with today's topic, the wild ecology of hunting and forest beasts in colonial India, British imperial and Indian Adivasi attitudes, 1820 to 1940, by none other than Professor Vijaya Ramadas Mandala. Professor Mandala is assistant professor in the Department of History in the University of Hyderabad. His field of specialization include environmental history, modern Indian history, and the French Revolution. His research interests are environment and empire, British imperial and Commonwealth history, animal studies, colonial governance, cultural geography, environmental histories of the Gonds and the Baigas, colonial education and architecture and the French Revolution of 1789. Before joining the University of Hyderabad, he was a junior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library from 2014 to 16 and taught in India since 2011 and also taught at the University of Manchester, UK, 2006 to 2011. His books include Shooting a Tiger, Big Game Hunting, Conversation in Colonial India. Some of his journal articles include British Huntswoman in Colonial India, Imperialism and Gender Hierarchies, Colonialism and the Spatial Dimension of Play, Education and the Creation of Middle Class Space at School and Colleges in Modern India. So I hope everyone is there to you, sir.
Thank you, Disha. Can I start my talk?
Yes, sir, I'm good.
There
Please
is
start.
a bit of disconnectivity. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pallab, and thanks for the organizing committee of the Voices of the Periphery. Today, I will speak my recent publication, which was published in Professor Aloka Parashar's edited volume. The book was titled Conversations with the Animate Other, Historical Representations of Human and Non-Human Interactions in India. So one chapter I contributed. This was a kind of evolving of my research from Shooting a Tiger book to when I joined Teenmurti Library when Professor Mahesh Rangarajan was the director. I began to work on two of the indigenous Adivasi tribes, the Gonds and the Baigas. So I also published separate articles on the Gonds, the making and unmaking of the Gonds, like hunting modes of these Adivasi tribes in colonial central India. Today's lecture is about when Professor Aloka Parashar took charge of running a project at the University of Hyderabad, like a couple of years ago. She asked me to work on a kind of evolving history between how British colonizers were looking at Indian ecology, Indian wildlife, vis-a-vis how Indian societies, in particular Adivasi tribes, were also perceiving Indian ecology. Since my specialization was not just colonial, imperial, and Commonwealth history, but also I began to look at Adivasi histories of hunting. So I thought that I could make a comparative analysis of the kind of attitudes that emerged during British colonial rule, but also how Adivasi tribes like Baigas and Gonds in central India were looking at you know their perception of ecology, their cultural attitude towards forests, wildlife, geography. So this is a comparative analysis of Adivasi attitudes towards wildlife and ecology vis-a-vis British colonizers' attitude towards Indian ecology. What I will do in this next 55 minutes, first I will introduce some of the fresh archive uh, as part of today's talk concerning how Baigos and Gonda Adivasis were looking at um, the concept of ecology. The forest environment, but also wildlife. And latter part of the lecture, I will elucidate how British colonizers were looking at Indian environment, but also Indian animals like the tiger and other wildlife creatures, wildlife species. So I start a bit with um,
I want to tell you that we are going live on YouTube, sir. So there are
okay,
people watching you.
okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Everybody.
Um, yeah. So what I'm going to do is in the first half is Adivasi attitudes. This is where I bring up three kind of conceptual frameworks. That is called anthropocentric, biocentric, and ecocentric. Anthropocentric is like how humans were appropriating not only natural environment but also wild animals, geography, river valleys, and so on. Biocentric is a kind of where humans were coexisting with other non-human species on this planet Earth. So ecocentric perspective emerged much later when Jim Corbett, the famous hunter-turned conservationist, began to articulate for tiger conservation in northern India from 1930s onwards. So this ecocentric perspective was also articulated by one of the Norwegian philosopher and ecologist Arnos in his deep ecology. So in today's lecture, we are not speaking about ecocentric perspective. Rather, I bring the biocentric, how humans can coexist with the natural world, um, coexist with non-human species. This kind of understanding I found when I was reading about Baigos and Gond Adivasi, oral traditions. Though they were, I used English translated version, but nonetheless, it helps us, to understand how their engagement with the Indian environment in on the Satpura Mountains, on Maika Hills, today's Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, differs from how British colonizers were looking at Indian ecology, engaging with the Indian wild animals like the tiger. So this comparative kind of perspective, uh, uh, when we juxtapose British and Indian Adivasis, we can find lot of difference. So the British colonizers' attitude towards the Indian ecology and the animal would have always been anthropocentric. This is one understanding I found when I'm examining the archives of the memoirs of the British military officers, administrators, governors general, viceroys, even British collectors and judges. The whole repository, colonial archive from the company period to later British Raj shows a strong inclination towards anthropocentric perspective. That is human at the center of this world. And whereas when we look at early Buddhist traditions, that includes the Jatakas since the 5th century before Christ, it advocates a biocentric perspective where all living organisms, including animals and trees, must be valued as much as humans love themselves. So this kind of Buddhist approach to biocentric perspective can also be extended to some of the Adivasis' engagement with the natural world in central India, what is today's Chhattisgarh and parts of Madhya Pradesh, among the Gonds and the Baiga tribes. Uh, this is how we going to understand two parameters between the British colonizers and Indian Adivasi tribes. Um, Now here I put a couple of questions concerning to understand what was Adivasi attitudes towards Indian ecology in the central part of India. So before going to that, then British had a different kind of attitudes. That's what I've been saying. So the early ecological imaginings of the Britons in Indian wildlife demonstrate their articulation of utilitarian philosophy of governance and anthropocentric discernment, which distinguished the human from the non-human civilization from the wild. So this kind of thing was quite prominent among the British colonizers. Henceforth, taming the wild became a nomenclature in the Britain's desire to control the faunal wealth. Governmentality applied to wild animals in Britain's discourse in India was a simple subterfuge to control India's exotic ecology and its hitherto unseen big animals of unusual size and mysterious birds of the rarest kind, like unusual size of animals like elephant and the tiger. So British approach was quintessentially utilitarian, but also anthropocentric. But governmentality was intrinsically linked with how they were looking at our Indian ecology, all over India, not just central India, whether in the Bengal presidency, Madras presidency, Bombay presidency, northwestern part of Indian subcontinent, Awadh, and so on. Now, for example, when the Britons initially stumbled upon tropical animals like the tiger and leopard, the bear, and the hawk, their utilitarian thinking framed these wild animals causing the greatest depredations on human settlements across all parts of the Indian subcontinent. This was also one of the findings from my book, Shooting a Tiger. When British came, when they began to encounter Indian animals like the tiger, elephant, leopard, they began to see these animals as a threat to civilization. Here, Britons were trying to expand their agrarian base, their taxation regime across, fringe and arable landscapes of the Indian subcontinent. This is where they found animals like tiger, leopard, wild boar, crocodiles, even elephants as nemesis to civilization. This is where they brought hunting as a kind of a policy to eliminate all carnivorous animals, any kind of animal that was threatening the expansionist project of the British colonizers. This was quite evident, when I was doing PhD at Manchester, I discovered, I came across some of the very interesting documents. One is pertaining to Colonial Bengal presidency, other is from the Madras presidency. This was like year 1822, where, nearly 5,000 plus tigers, 5,400 or some tigers, were exterminated between 1822 to 1824. In the span of 2 years, more than 5,000 tigers were exterminated just in Bengal presidency alone. And this I call it as vermin eradication policy. This is where I link that, shikar or hunting in colonial India was not merely a recreational sport, but intimately linked with colonial governance. Britain's mentality was, to create a commercial kind of enterprise in the name of, Enlightenment Project. So wild animals were now brought under their orbit because they were also trying to access forest resources. So animals like tiger, initially when the elephant posed a threat, So this way, we look at the utilitarian kind of mentality that can be seen in the case of the British colonizers since the days of the company period. Now, here I bring an interesting perspective even from Shefali Rasmandar's work. She points out that the representations of animals during British rule in India took an interesting rationale. Tigers, elephants, ghaus, and wild boars were an important part of creating and maintaining the hierarchies that became colonialism's quintessential facade. So Shafali Raman says that hierarchies were also attributed through wild animals. So that is an extended argument, uh, apart from my argument that hunting in colonial India represents quintessential kind of colonial governmentality, whether under the company laws or in the later British laws. Now, going to Adivasi attitudes towards hunting and the natural environment, I will give some examples from Gonds and the Baigos. Among the Adivasi tribes of India, such as the Gonds and Baigos, hunting was biocentric sustenance since the pre-colonial period. Earlier I said that British colonialism was a project of anthropocentric governance across Indian subcontinent from 1800 to till 1947. Despite, Jim Corbett was advocating quintessential conservation of the tiger species. Now I put biocentric perspective for the Gonds and Baigos. Here, I begin our discussion on the hunting tradition of Gonds and Adivasis to exemplify their attitude towards wild animals and engagement with the natural environment in mountainous regions such as Satpura mountains, Maika hills, particularly in today's Chhattisgarh, but also Madhya Pradesh, two districts, Mandla and Balagarh districts in today's Madhya Pradesh. So these questions are, quite important to understand Adivasi attitudes towards wild ecology. Wild ecology is another term, another kind of framework I speak in today's lecture. For me, wild ecology means, we have Aldo Leopold, one of the prominent conservationists in the United States of America, who was advocating ecocentric perspective. Ecocentric perspective is where governments have a duty to uphold the balance of nature, because we are living in advanced industrial civilization where capitalism was quite rampant, where natural resources, regard for non-human life was considered not so important. This is when Aldo Leopold, one of the famous American conservationists, began to advocate that America should establish national parks. Look at Yosemite National Park, Yellowstone National Park. A lot of national parks came to the fore because of the advocacy of this very interesting, important figure, Aldo Leopold. So he also uses this term ecology. But in today's lecture, when I'm using this term, wild ecology, I'm referring to not engagement with capitalism, but I'm looking into how, when British were venturing into interior landscapes of India, whether it's forests, mountains, or river bodies, thick jungles, like Sundarbans in Bengal region, how they began to observe uh, Indian ecology in its quite um, um, pristine state during the time of the company Ross. So they also began to look at, stumble upon indigenous tribes like the Gonds, Baigos, Santals or Bills or Todas in Nilgiri mountains. Then they began to, write down what they were witnessing since the days of the company Ross. So here wild ecology is how wild ecology was looked, observed and written by British administrators or British soldiers or officers or judges, whomever are venturing into the, fringe and arable landscapes of India writing down in their memoirs. This is what, the term wild ecology I'm referring to in today's lecture. Now, concerning tribal hunters, this is where two, three questions I wish to put before you. So, what was society like among the Gonds and the Bygos in the colonial period? Okay, here again, I'm bringing how Gonds and Bygos were involved in hunting, why they were involved in hunting even during 19th century, uh, and how they were looking at natural environment. So these are the questions we can think of. Now, what are the critical phases in defining the Gonds and Bygos attitudes towards not only carnivorous animals like tigers and leopards, but also herbivores like the deer and antelope? So this is where I'm bringing not just carnivorous animals, which were considered as nemesis to civilization in the British colonial discourse since the days of the Company Laws, but how Adivasis like Gonds and Baigas were looking not only at tigers and leopards, which were carnivorous animals, but also herbivores like the deer and antelope. And what kind of relationship was forged between the Adivasi tribes and the natural environment vis-a-vis flora and fauna in the 19th century India? So this is where we can locate Adivasi tribes like the Gonds and Baigas engagement with India's natural environment during 19th century. So this is the one of the general picture we come we can figure it out when we read the not only English translated archive, even when we look at Gond oral songs, Bygos oral songs. This is the kind of picture emerges based on how the Adivasi culture was represented vis-a-vis in relation to India's wild ecology in central India. So tribal or Adivasi hunters were not scared of unexpected encounters with wild animals such as tigers, leopards, or crocodiles. So available archival repositories show that Indian Adivasi tribes lived in a hostile forest environment amid dangerous beasts of prey. And these Adivasis led a relatively free life, devoid of external oppression, until the influx of the British into the tribal regions. I know that there is a work by Sumit Guha and some of other historians that Marathas engaged with Bill tribes, but concerning my findings of Adivasi tribes like the Gonds and Bygos on Satpura mountains, on the higher slopes of the Satpura mountains, I think they were still able to live a kind of isolated lifestyle. It was quite sparsely populated area. When where Gonds were living, some of the Adivasi Gonds, which were not mixed with the mainstream Indian population, whether of they were Hindu civilization or even Mughal civilization when Islam came. Especially the Bygars were not so much exposed to outside civilizational influence. This is my argument based on the kind of when they were using bows and arrows, sometimes axe, shafts. These are quite primitive weapons, and these kind of primitive kind of hunting cultures were there among uh, mountainous Adivasi tribes in the region of the Satpura Hills, today's mountainous regions in the Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh state. So this is where I put this wild ecology framework. Now, the ancient Gondwana, this is where I bring Adivasi's attitudes in relation to Central Indian wild ecology. So the ancient Gondwana or the country of the Gonds comprises not only most of today's Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, but also bordering regions of the present-day Upper Telangana and Upper Andhra, northeastern Maharashtra, southeastern Gujarat. Unlike the other mixed race Gonds who embraced Hinduism and some form of Islam, the Aboriginal or Adivasi Gonds inhabited below and above the Satpura mountain range for the first 2 millennia. So they were there since the time of, when Satavahanas Guptas were there. Uh, we know that, Gond oral tradition tells that Gonds were into these, Central Indian mountain ecology. Their forms of nature worship were often ingrained in deep ecology. So this is another kind of thing we get when we look into the historical trajectory of the Gonds. I think this is one kind of archival evidence came from Reverend Stephen Hislop. I think he was a Christian missionary trying to uh, reach out these Adivasi tribes. Whenever he was trying to reach out, they began to run away from him. But one of the interesting thing is, how he recorded, two of the events. He lived there in the central provinces nearly for 2 decades, 19 years. This is when he began to record his encounters, how Adivasis were engaged in different kind of activities with Central Indian wild ecology. This is where he speaks about the courage among some of the Gonds in the central provinces. So this is one of the reference I bring forth from one of the archival document from missionary Stephen Hislop. He now speaks about the courage of the Adivasi hunters. Their courage, that is, the courage of the Adivasi hunters is remarkable. The instance is freshly remembered in the Chhindwara district in today's Madhya Pradesh, where an English officer was saved from instant death in the grip of a panther. I think this must be a leopard, by the bravery of a Gond hunter. And still more recently, a wounded officer on the Godavari river was rescued from the wild beast by his native hunter. So Stephen Hislop records some of the instances where some of the colonial English officers were rescued by either a Gond hunter or other indigenous hunters who were assisting them in these shikar trips. So this kind of humanism among the Adivasi tribes of India can be interpreted as biocentric environmentalism as opposed to anthropocentric liberalism, which became the cornerstone of colonialism. So this is where Adivasis were quite helpful even for the British colonizers. But their biocentric environmentalism was quite human as well. So that is my argument here for bringing Stephen Hislop's archival evidence during middle of the 19th century in today's Madhya Pradesh and parts of Godavari belt. While wild animals like tigers, lions, leopards, crocodiles, hippos and rhinoceroses are known to be ferocious and violent in their survival mechanism for millennia, humans have also adapted this predatory characteristic of aggressiveness in their undertaking of taming the wild and regulating the ecology for the sustenance. Now, when we compare, the British engagement with Indian natural environment and Adivasis like, the Gonds and by the Baigos engagement with natural environment, I think there was a distinctive kind of engagement that was taking place into colonial history or in the history of the Adivasi tribes like the Gonds and the Baigos. So we need to make a distinction between the British and the Adivasis. While this was not manifested in the British hunting genres, and memoirs of their became exploits in colonial India, among the Gond and Baiga Adivasi people, aggression is considered one interpret characteristic through which a tribal hunter could kill a forest beast. Here, tribals were living in a hostile environment. Whether, when we go to first millennia, second millennia, even when Mughals were ruling most part of the Indian subcontinent, when Gond Adivasis were inhabiting Satpura mountains. One of the interesting thing about Adivasi tribal hunters was their engagement with the wild ecology, their engagement with natural environment. They did not have a kind of utilitarian concept or ideological underpinnings that British were having when they began to occupy large swaths of Indian subcontinent, including forest territories. This is where an Adivasi would kill a tiger only if the tiger attacks him or attacks his family. So this is the fundamental difference between Adivasi attitudes towards India's wild beasts, vis-a-vis as opposed to the British colonizers. One of the fundamental distinction we can make. Now, concerning Gond oral tradition. So, Gond oral traditions tell that they were primeval tribes and roamers in the forest who ventured into rough and stony mountains and thick jungles in search of wild game and forest produce for the pot. Elsewhere, my research has shown that scores of wild nilgai, what we call blue bull or antelope, um, they in bone oral tradition they referred as scores of the deer rather than one group of the deer, different groups of the deer. Gonds have this one of the oral song which mentions about Saint Lingo. Saint Lingo is what is today's incarnation of Lord Shiva. Um, and the Saint Lingo, I think this must have happened sometime during after the fall of the Gupta Empire. Uh, this is where this oral song can be attributed to. So Gonds were totally very wild, very aboriginal. They didn't have any contact with the mainstream civilization. This figure, Saint Lingo, who became the Gond leader, whom Gonds began to worship as Lord Shiva, incarnation of Lord Shiva, uh, introduced the art of agriculture. The interesting thing about this oral song of the Gonds was how they killed scores of the Rohis. Rohis here meant antelope, the blue bull. Initially, I was thinking that this was deer, but again, I was looking into that Gondi language and English transliteration. It appears to be there were large number of blue bulls quite present on the Satpura mountain wild ecology during first millennia as well as in the during the Mughal times. This is when this story was quite began to be appropriated into came from the Gond folklore. And so the Saint Lingo actually introduced the art of agriculture among the Gonds. And after this rice or whatever the wheat crop was grown, rice crop I think, it was eaten by these rohis, those antelopes, blue bulls. And the Saint Lingo got angry. Then he, with the help of other Gond tribal hunters, chases these deer and because they were angry because they were already hungry. Now they embrace the art of agriculture. That agriculture crop, whatever they worked so hard, nearly for 6 to 8 months, now eaten by these deer or antelope. So the Gond god, the Saint Lingo, got angry. Eventually, he kills all this deer. So deer hunting that became now integral part of the Gond culture, Gond customs and rituals since the time of second millennia. So this is where Gond oral folk songs are quite important in how deer were considered, even antelopes like blue bulls were considered as enemies among the Gond community, which was a pre-colonial engagement that continued even into the colonial period. Now, despite this transformation of subsistence to agriculture, as detailed in the Lingo story, this particular saintly person introduced the art of agriculture among the Gond community. They did not issue hunting because it remained their first line of defense in a hostile natural world. So this is where I bring the biocentric perspective. Why hunting remained um, an important occupation among Indian Adivasi tribes like the Gonds and the Baigos, even when until even colonial rule came in the parts of central India. Despite they were practicing shifting cultivation, they did not abandon, they did not eschew hunting because it was a natural world in central provinces was quite hostile. They were living among the very precarious forest environment where they were full of wild animals like tigers, leopards, crocodiles, snakes. So they need to be constantly on alert in their day-to-day life. Hunting was one survival mechanism among the Gonds. It was a practical necessity, but they were having this biocentric, live, let live. If the tiger doesn't attack us, we are okay. But if a tiger attacks any of my family member, even myself, or if a deer destroys our agricultural fields, then we need to take an action. So they would kill a deer if the deer or antelopes begin to eat their crop, their shifting cultivation crop. In the case of hunting, sometimes they need to, in the times of rainy season, during winter, they were totally reliant on hunting. So deer was also eaten by them. Earlier, they were totally like tigers and leopards. They were also totally into carnivorous kind of eating, the Gond Adivasis. Hence, this term aboriginal was, typically applied even by the British ethnographers because of this meat-eating habits. They would kill the deer, they would kill the wild boar, they would kill the antelope. They feast on them through rituals and festivals, uh, which is quite recurrent. So this is where their culture is quite unique when compared with British intervention of big game hunting that began to enter across the fringe and interior landscapes of India. So Adivasi's culture, Adivasi's engagement was quite utilitarian compared with the British colonizers. This is where we look into Adivasi's engagement with Indian ecology. Now, other thing is the idea and practice of hunting among the Gonda Adivasis. So it not only embodied the social stratification of their societies, but also the wild ecology of the forest necessitated them to develop a certain eco-spiritual belief system in the highland mountains of central India. There is, thing called, even if you go today on the outskirts of the national parks, we have different tiger reserves in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. Government now designated these as strictly for the protection of tiger species and other species like leopards and other wild animals. But on the outskirts of these national parks, we have some of the Adivasi hamlets. When we go there, they still, when we speak to these Baiga women or Baiga men or some of the Gondi population, they tell us, they still practice animism. Their worship is different from Islam, different from mainstream Hinduism. Animal worship. They believe in nature. They worship sun and moon. They also believe that tiger, there was a thing called tiger god. They did not have any built temples. Tiger god is worshipped when you pass through any kind of railway station like Jabalpur, going towards Raigad in Odisha. We stumble upon a lot of eastern gods, but also central Indian mountain landscapes. So we stumble upon tiger being worshipped in the open spaces. These were previously also inhabited by Gond Adivasi population, but also Baiga Adivasi population. So this animal kind of uh, pantheism is quite unique character. How Adivasis were using wild ecology, how their way of spiritual belief system was different from mainstream mainland Indian societies, but also vis-a-vis British colonizers. This is another thing we can find how Adivasis were leading their survival mechanism even during the time of the British colonial rule. during 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, I wish to bring some of the things related to uh, how Adivasi tribes and forest beasts were taking shape in the wild ecology of central India, their mediation, um, um, as per colonial records, but also oral sources of that point in time, like 1850 to 1910, 1920. Here I bring wilderness. Wilderness defined the Adivasi tribes' territoriality, where the hill goats and bygons tried to find congenial solitude away from civilizational interference. One of the characteristics, though they were humans, they were tribes, Adivasis. Hence, they didn't want mainstream form of life. They would prefer to live on a mountain slope. Uh, uh, Maybe they wanted to build a hut on the top of a tree. Despite there was threats from tigers, leopards, sometimes man-eating tigers, man-eating leopards, snakes, crocodiles, different kind of very wild ecologies, full of wilderness. They prefer that this is how we wanted to live through coexistence. Despite threats were there, Adivasis were preferring, we wanted to live in this forest. So wilderness was one of the characteristics that defined their Adivasi identity, their ideas and practices of hunting, their ideas of conservation thinking, their ideas of constant mediation between the physical environment and ongoing interaction, conflict, and negotiation with the forest beasts in the natural environment of the central India. Now we have different kind of Gond subgroups of Adivasis. They were called, Maria Gonds, Muria Gonds, Hill Marias, Dandami Marias, which I will not go into the detail, but I will give some more examples concerning another tribe, that is the Baigos. Uh, Baigos is another indigenous Adivasi tribe. The other indigenous Adivasi tribe, the Baigos, were also portrayed in the colonial archive as fearless, trustworthy, independent, ready enough to give their opinion, and very willing to assist. And the way the Baigos used to manage their communities merits a high prize. The Baigos were enormously active and industrious when it came to the occupation of hunting and chasing. So Baigos were very wild tribes. Gonds considered Baigos as priests. Whenever a man-eating tiger kills, or a tribal was killed by a tribal man, an Adivasi man or Adivasi woman was killed by a tiger or a leopard, they would bring the Baiga priest. The Baiga priest again performs some kind of ritual, so that they believe that if the ritual would not be performed, the ghost of this human being will harass the nearby villagers. So tiger, more and more tigers can become man-eaters. So that was the reason why all these kind of it was superstitious. Despite these people were superstitious, whether the Gonds and Baigos, this ritual mechanism was one kind of ontological discourse where they can survive in that interior forest landscapes, interior wild ecology of the Satpura mountains, other mountain terrains in Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. So this is how this superstition was there. But that is one part of how they wanted to overcome any kind of fear by living in the midst of the wild beasts in the natural environment of India during the time of the British colonial rule. Um, Now, there are some more interesting things that we can figure it out when we look into Baigos. Baigos were also described as the first-rate sportsmen. They were good experts in making traps and pitfalls in the jungles. Their sportsmanship is palpable when using their small bows and arrows in the pursuit of dangerous carnivores such as tigers or leopards, as well as non-dangerous herbivores. So Bygos would attack only leopards and tigers until unless they were a threat to their lives. But usually they would hunt herbivores because herbivores were eaten as meat by these Baiga community. Herbivores were kind of subsistence among Adivasi Baiga tribe in central India. Not having any other weapon but carrying only an axe on the shoulder, a Baiga Adivasi would wander in the desolate part of the jungles and would climb a tree with utmost speed when attacked or ambushed by a tiger. So sometimes when a tiger suddenly ambushes a Baiga Adivasi who was passing through some kind of path in the midst of the jungle, he would try to climb a tree rather than he wanted to kill a tiger. You can see this is one example of the biocentric perspective. If you look at a British officer, a military officer, or a colonial governor general, he rather would take a high velocity rifle and wanted to kill Indian tiger. But Bygos' attitude was different. He would run. Then if tiger goes back, he would not harm the tiger. But if tiger retaliates, then he would take axe. There were instances in a very Baiga uh, records, some of the Baiga Adivasi hunters killed some of the man-eating tigers when they were trying to kill, fellow Baiga. He just killed the tiger with axe only, the primitive weapon. So that kind of bravery was there among the Baiga Adivasi tribes. So look at how wild ecology, engagement with wild ecology concerning the Adivasi tribes like the Baigas was quite different. Um, Though the Bygos tried to avoid the beastly predators out of respect, this is what I put it very categorically, out of respect. That is, they have that cultural attitude because they were inhabiting the wild terrain along with the beasts of prey. So they had some kind of consideration towards these animals. We see them every day, and these are tiger gods. Let's not disrupt them. But if a tiger becomes a man eater, he would not tolerate. So this is the fun, slightly difference. Wild beasts of prey were respected, unless they would become a threat. Thus, the Bygos will not hesitate to attack tigers if it is to save a comrade. It was reported that even the dogs are so thoroughly familiarized with those conflicts that a case is known of a tiger having been torn from its human prey by the attacks of a puny looking Baiga. So one Baiga was attacked by a tiger. Now this Bygos man, the puny looking Bygos dog came and it attacked the tiger. And so tiger being diverted. That day, this particular dog saved its Bygos owner. So you can see the kind of encounters between tigers and Bygos were a recurring phenomenon during 19th and early part of the 20th century. Sometimes apart from tigers, I said that they also would do hunting expeditions, and Bygos' capabilities of standing fatigue and privations are remarkable. Sometimes when they don't get food during the absence of shifting cultivation, they are ready to undergo privation. This is a recurring kind of phenomenon. Not only we can collaborate with the English officer sources, but also in the Baiga oral tradition. This kind of picture emerges. On their hunting expeditions, which sometimes last 3 or 4 days, the Baigos subsist almost entirely either on what they kill or, if unsuccessful, on roots and fruits found in the forest. Even when occupied with his fields, the love of field sports seems inherent in the Baiga. And in the rains, when he has little else to do, he and his companions amuse themselves by running down Sambar. Sambar is one of the largest deer species, and spotted deer, with their dogs, following them in the water and killing them with their axes when brought to bread. So deer killing was one of the thing that is common among the Baikos. Now I'll give one final example of the Baikos before moving on to British colonizers' attitudes towards Indian wild ecology, but towards also forest beasts of prey, most importantly the tiger. This is one example where one Baika woman one day, I think this was reported by Colonel A.W. Macmillan in the 1900s. Um, uh, s- uh, he actually was a missionary traveling through today's Chhattisgarh and parts of Madhya Pradesh near Satpura mountains. One day he was walking in one of the tribal villages. This was a Baiga village. Here, one lady, this was actually reported to him rather, which he recounted his memoir around 1904, 1903 or 1904. A Baiga woman was cooking food. She had a 4-year-old boy, infant, in her lap, and she also had another 6-year-old child. The 6-year-old boy was stalked by a tiger. Suddenly, it was trying to snatch the 6-year-old boy around evening, around this time, 6 to 6:45 p.m., like that. Um, the moment this Baiga woman was cooking, she was also looking after her 4-year-old infant. She was also observing her 6-year-old other child, elder boy. She looked. She in the fire, in the firelight, she could see a tiger was stalking her elder son. So when the tiger approached nearby, trying to snatch, kidnap this boy, 6-year-old boy, she took that fire log and she threw it onto the tiger. So the tiger ran away. It got burnt with the fire log. This Baika woman was cooking. So you can see the bravery of even tribal Adivasi women in the midst of the wild ecology. This incident, according to A.W. Macmillan, occurred sometime between 1903 or 1904. Now, I will move on to the final part. That is, now we discussed, how Baigos and goats were engaging with Indian natural environment. Now let us see what was the British attitudes towards hunting and Indian wild ecology. This is again comes from my primary argument in my book, Shooting a Tiger. For the British in India, shikar or hunting was not merely a recreational activity. I do not argue that hunting was merely a sport, but a manifestation of the ruling virtue, demonstration, and consolidation of their governing mission on the fringe territories of India. So, thus, shikar or became hunting for the British was developed as a ruler's prerogative, following their borrowing from pre-colonial Indian rulers' hunting ideas and practices. So, British knew that Mughals, even Vijayanagara rulers, or different kind of Indian regional satraps were Indian princes were into hunting. So Machan was one they incorporated from Indian tradition of shikar. But one fundamental distinction was introduction of the high velocity rifles. Other is, I don't know whether I can connect with Enlightenment philosophy, but certainly we can connect with Protestant way of ethic. Protestantism during the time of Renaissance also brought rationalist kind of mindset among Western European nations. So Britons now they became Anglican Church. Now they were into mercantilism. They were into capitalist enterprise. Now they were looking non-European world was very exotic because the opportunity for shooting a tiger, shooting a lion in Africa, shooting a giraffe, shooting a rhino was totally absent back in Europe. So when they came to India, they found it. Oh, this is very exotic. For the first time, I came up. I stumbled upon a tiger, and this wild beast looks very magnificent. While looking at the tiger, they began to also record tiger was no longer friendly to the humans. Tigers were becoming more and more man-eaters under British colonial rule. One simple explanation can be under the East India Company was a mercantilist enterprise now transformed into a political enterprise. So under this political enterprise, they began to expand agricultural clusters. They were creating new agricultural villages. They were bringing some of the chamars were brought from what is today's Uttar Pradesh, today's Bihar, parts of Jharkhand, to the areas like Chhattisgarh. New agricultural clusters were created. This is when Indian wild ecology began to undergo a different kind of change. If not, Satpura mountain slopes. In the plains of India, which were erstwhile forest territories, forests were cut down. British were now constructing new kind of villages, asking different kind of migrant communities across Indian subcontinent to practice agriculture. So this is also expansion of the taxation regime across rural country, across Indian subcontinent. This is when they began to bring big game hunting as a kind of not recreational sport. I'm sure hunting was offering that kind of avenue for them, but it was also a governing mission. That is my fundamental argument. Tigers were becoming troublesome. Tigers erstwhile were totally dependent on eating herbivore like deer, antelope, wild boar, other kind of species. Now they began to eat humans. They have become man-eaters. Man-eaters were more and more recorded during British colonial period, rather than we can attribute man-eaters in pre-colonial period. We know that Emperor Akbar also killed a man-eating tiger. That was only that kind of an emperor killing a man-eating tiger that we find in Akbarnama was again a kind of a royal prerogative. Now, in colonial India, this was no longer the case. It's not a viceroy or a governor general or a British collector. It was ordinary soldiers, planters, ordinary even any kind of, someone who was coming from Europe. Everyone were ventured into hunting of the tigers. So it became a kind of colonial governing ideology. So this is the one of the fundamental thing. Anthropomorphization of Indian ecology, anthropomorphization of Indian wildlife began to take place. And this also became a literary discourse. Not that, they left the memoirs, but there were a lot of governing correspondence from the time of the company period to later British Raj. We can find how tigers were attacking humans. They became man-eaters. Leopards became man-eaters. So this kind of report was also coming. So it kind of, it compelled them that we need to eradicate these animals because they were threatening our colonial rule. They were also threatening the prestige of a British officer, prestige of so-called company rule. So from company period onwards, we could see company maintained a systematic policy called vermin eradication. In this vermin eradication, it's not wolves, snakes, or wild boar. No, it was the tigers, leopards, even elephants. Elephants were also in large number, shot dead. Today's look at Salsetta. Today's Mumbai was once upon a time Salsetta Island, which became a city of Bombay, now Mumbai city. Once upon a time, a large number of elephants were hunted and shot dead by British military officers. This was again because elephants were considered a kind of vermin. Vermin means troublesome, nemesis to civilization, threat to human life, threat to agrarian base, threat to villagers, threat to village livestock. So this is how large number of tigers and elephants were hunted during the company period. But after 1870s, British considered that elephants are too valuable. Then they took inspiration from Madras Elephant Preservation Act, which was promulgated in 1873, which became All India Preservation Act, that elephants cannot be hunted. Elephants are now government monopoly. Shooting them is strictly prohibited. Not a British royal, not Viceroy of India, not a Governor General, not even provincial governors were allowed to shoot any elephant after All India Elephant Preservation Act was brought forth. And it's a colonial legislation. Now we are speaking about making of the constitution in terms of the management of wild ecology. This is when British realized that elephant is too valuable. Let's not hunt. Let's also not others to hunt. So they strictly began to protect elephants um, from 1879 onwards. This was again one of the utilitarian approach. It's not love for elephants, but they find elephants were friendly. Elephants were extremely useful. Tiger was not useful. So this kind of anthropocentric utilitarian governing ideology was deployed in the management of not only Indian wild ecology, but also colonizers' attitudes towards forest beasts of prey. Now, before I stop, I give an example of uh, James Outram, which you might find interesting. Um, uh, this is James Outram was an officer during the days of the English East India Company. Um, so James Outram was an officer who was deployed in the western part of India. I have written a chapter called "Hunt as a Metaphor of Food," which was part of Shooting a Tiger book, first chapter. Here I have illustrated how British officer hunters like James Outram frequently stumbled upon animals like lions and tigers in the Khandesh and Kathiawar region of interior Gujarat and Maharashtra, today's Western India. Thus, the British attitudes, as outlined in the career of Outram, offer a glimpse of the extensive assimilation of hunting practices into the daily lives of colonial men. Along with performing his colonial official duties, Outram regularly practiced shikar and hog hunting as a form of military training. Here, other thing, how wild ecology was appropriated by British officers like James Outram for the construct new language of masculinity. When we look at Victorian England, there was masculinity was developing. They say that during the high stages of British imperialism, the notion of masculine, a British officer has to be very physically fit, capable of enduring rain or snow or floods or even heat. Many Europeans used to die during the time of the Company Ross. So I trace this theory of masculinity during the days of the Company Ross, rather than many scholars who argue that it was a later British Ross phenomenon. High stages of British imperialism brought forth the notion of masculinity, militarized masculine lives of the British colonial officers in non-European world. This highly militarized masculine culture was emerging not back in Europe, but in non-European world. Because non-European world, like tropical world like India, Indian wild ecology, Western India was very hot at the time. Temperatures were also recorded like 38, 40 degrees during the time of James Outram. Where one time he was going for a battle with one of the plundering Bill tribes, Adivasi tribes. Bill Adivasis were attacking the borders of in Khandesh region, which were under the control of the Company Ross. So Outram was a lieutenant military officer, and he took some of the bills. He didn't kill any bill. This is what I'm repeatedly saying. He learned long ways of the bills He began to kill man-eating tigers and leopards. This is how he befriended the Bill community. He became like a kind of a local god among the Bill Adivasis. So he never killed a Bill. He always persuaded them that you listen to me. Then, from plunderers, he converted them into forest gods, or like a kind of a Bill corps around 1830s. So one time he was going after a man-eating tiger. This particular tiger killed, rather tigress. It killed around a few people, 25 to 28 people in the span of 2 3 years. That day he got the opportunity. It was just killed a human being in the nearby Adivasi hamlet. Then he took five billmen with bow and arrow. Outram had a pistol, rifle. He also carried a hunting knife. They chased this tiger nearly for 5 kilometers. Tiger now entered into a cave, trying to hide from the sight of the Outram and his five Adivasi followers. He feared that they might kill this tigress. So what he did was he gave his rifle to his bill assistants who were carrying bows and arrows, and he took only the hunting knife. He pulled this tigress, then with physical valor, he took the hunting knife and stabbed this man-eating tigress. So he wanted to show to the, this was a deliberate action, I think. He wanted to show the bills that he doesn't require a modern weapon like rifle. Rather, he can use his physical prowess and subdue the beast. So this was one kind of how wild ecology was used to reconstruct a new articulation of masculinity that can be seen in the lives and careers of officers like James Outram. So British attitudes towards the wild ecology, management of the forest beasts was very much, creating a posterity for themselves. It was a kind of exploitative framework, but new articulation, new discourse of masculinity came to the fore. So this is one argument I bring forth. How colonial governing ideology was very much linked with how they were interacting or engaging, but also appropriating Indian elements like elephants or tigers. So this is where that example comes forth. Now, let me go to the conclusion. There are, in that particular chapter, there are lots of examples, but let me conclude. So today's lecture outlined how the framework of wild ecology is important to understanding the anthropomorphic and biocentric attitudes towards the Indian environment, both among the Adivasi tribes, such as the Gonds and Baigas that we discussed in the first part, as well as the British colonizers. While pre-colonial Indian traditions lent a certain agency to the forest beasts through Buddhist Jatakas and other ontological discourses, for the British in India, during their rule, they viewed the wild ecology and animal world from anthropocentric and utilitarian governance perspectives, and hence were not attached to ecocentric value until the end of their rule. People like Jim Corbett. There was also a person called E.F. Burton, Richard Hamilton in the Nilgiri Mountains. These are the few exceptional British men who were living in India, who were born in India, began to articulate the kind of ecocentric perspective that was advocated by this American conservationist Aldo Leopold. So our lecture has used colonial records, writings, diaries, reports, but also Adivasi oral traditions to reconstruct a historical picture of hunting among the Adivasi tribes by examining the viewpoints of the foreign people, the British, but with an urge not to idealize or create an exotic pristine picture of these communities. That is, the Adivasi Gonds and the Baigas. Adivasis consumed hunted animals for food and survival. In the case of the British, the hunted animals were utilized to justify their colonial governing mission. Besides, the trophies of animals represented their masculine birth and taming of the Indian ecology. Finally, the commodity capitalism of the 19th century became bold, enabled the British to accumulate profit from the wild animals they killed. So, to conclude, by juxtaposing the hunting modes of the Adivasi tribes, such as the Gonds and the Baigos, in the central provinces against the British colonizers, today's lecture has successfully elucidated the biocentric and ecocentric reflections among Indian societies, especially the Adivasi tribes like the Gonds and the Baigots, towards wild ecology and forest peace. This kind of comparative analysis is useful when we look at how animals were represented as categories of human manipulation in the British colonial discourse. On the contrary, among the Adivasi tribes of India, wild ecology and hunting were for coexistence, not for conquering or destroying the natural environment. Thus, these tribes did not view the Indian environment or natural environment as something to be conquered or destroyed, but rather saw it as a sacred space that required mediation between humans and non humans. So that's the end of the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an enriching session. Um, I would now request everyone or anyone who would have their doubts or queries, they can write it in the chat box or they can ask directly. Okay, I think no one has any doubt. So, thank you so
Okay.
much for such an enriching session. And today we will cherish your every word. So, thank you so much. And with this, I wind up the evening and we'll see you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, whomever attended. Yeah, I'm glad. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
glad I could share some part of my research today. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pallav, and yeah, thank you. Yeah.